When 17-year-old Dylan Crawford wheeled himself out of his house that Tuesday morning in Cedar Falls, Iowa, he expected to see the wooden ramp his father had built for him 3 months earlier. Instead, he found splintered boards, twisted metal brackets, and spray-painted words that made his stomach drop. The ramp that had given him independence, that had allowed him to come and go from his own home without help, was completely destroyed. But Dylan had no idea that by the next morning, 70 leather-clad strangers would transform his driveway into something he never could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dylan Crawford had been in a wheelchair for 8 months when the bullying started getting worse. The car accident that changed everything happened on a rainy February night when he was 16. He'd been driving home from basketball practice. He was the starting point guard for Cedar Falls High when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into his Honda Civic at 60 miles per hour. The impact shattered his L2 and L3 vertebrae, and just like that, the kid who used to run 5 miles every morning was learning how to navigate the world from 3 feet lower. His father, Tom Crawford, was a construction foreman who'd worked on building sites his entire adult life. When Dylan came home from the rehabilitation center in Des Moines, Tom immediately saw the problem. Their 1970s ranch house had 3 concrete steps leading to the front door, steps that might as well have been Mount Everest for someone in a wheelchair. The back door wasn't any better, with a sliding glass door that opened onto a deck 4 feet off the ground. Tom spent every evening for 2 weeks after work building a ramp. Not just any ramp, a proper one with the correct grade, safety railings painted bright yellow, and a landing platform wide enough for Dylan to maneuver easily. He used pressure-treated lumber that cost him nearly $800, money the family didn't really have since Dylan's medical bills were piling up. But Tom didn't care about the cost. He cared about his son being able to leave the house without having to be carried. The ramp changed everything for Dylan. Suddenly, he could come and go as he pleased. He could wheel himself out to check the mail, go to the garage where he'd started working on model airplanes, or just sit outside and get some fresh air without asking for help. It was the first piece of independence he'd regained since the accident, and it meant everything to him. But not everyone in Cedar Falls was happy to see Dylan Crawford regaining his confidence. Jake Morrison had been Dylan's teammate on the basketball team before the accident. They'd never been close friends, but they'd gotten along well enough on the court. Jake was 2 inches taller and had always resented that Dylan got more playing time despite being shorter. When Dylan got hurt, Jake moved up to starting point guard, and suddenly he was the star he'd always wanted to be. The last thing he wanted was Dylan coming back around the school, reminding everyone of what the team used to be like. Jake wasn't alone in his resentment. His cousin, Brett Morrison, and their friend Chase Williams had formed a tight group that seemed to take pleasure in making Dylan's return to normal life as difficult as possible. It started small, comments in the hallway, accidentally bumping into his wheelchair, parking their cars in handicapped spaces so Dylan couldn't use them. The 3 boys had grown up together in Cedar Falls, and they all came from families with money and connections. Their parents owned businesses in town, served on the school board, donated to local charities. They were untouchable, and they knew it. Dylan tried to ignore them at first. His physical therapist, Maria Santos, had warned him that he might face some social challenges as he adjusted to his new reality. "Some people don't know how to act around someone in a wheelchair," she'd told him. "Give them time to adjust." Dylan figured the guys would get bored and move on to bothering someone else, but the harassment escalated instead of fading away. In November, Dylan found his wheelchair tires slashed in the school parking lot. The school's security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned that day, so there was no proof of who did it. His father had to take time off work to come pick him up and take the wheelchair to be repaired, another expense the Crawford family couldn't afford. In December, someone threw a rock through Dylan's bedroom window. It happened at 3 in the morning, shattering glass all over his bed while he slept. When his parents called the police, Officer Patricia Hughes came out and took a report, but there were no witnesses and no evidence. "Probably just kids being kids," she said, though the look in her eyes suggested she suspected it was more than that. The Crawford family didn't have many options. Tom worked 60-hour weeks just to keep up with the medical bills and the mortgage. Dylan's mother, Susan, had taken a part-time job at the local library to help with expenses. They couldn't afford to move, couldn't afford private school, couldn't afford a lawyer to go after the boys, who seemed determined to make Dylan's life miserable. Dylan's younger sister, Emma, a freshman at Cedar Falls High, became his fierce protector. She was small but scrappy, with the same determination that had made Dylan such a good athlete. When she heard Jake Morrison making jokes about Wheelchair Boy in the cafeteria, she marched right up to his table and dumped her chocolate milk over his head. She got suspended for 3 days, but she said it was worth it to see the look on his face. The school administration tried to help, but their hands were tied. Principal Margaret Davis called meetings with the Morrison and Williams families. But Jake's father, Richard Morrison, was a city council member, and Chase's mother, Linda Williams, owned the largest real estate company in town. The meetings ended with vague promises about talking to the boys and reminders about not jumping to conclusions without proof. Meanwhile, Dylan was struggling with more than just the bullying. The accident had taken away his dreams of playing college basketball, his plans to study sports medicine, his entire vision of what his future would look like. Some days, the weight of it all felt crushing. He'd wake up in the morning and for just a split second forget that his legs didn't work anymore. Then reality would hit him like a truck, and he'd have to find the strength to face another day. His parents tried to stay positive around him, but Dylan could see the stress wearing on them. His father's hands were always cut up from working construction, and now they were also stained with paint from building wheelchair ramps and modifying doorways. His mother had dark circles under her eyes from staying up late, organizing medical paperwork, and fighting with insurance companies. Emma had started getting into fights at school, her grades slipping as she spent more energy protecting her brother than focusing on her own studies. The ramp became a symbol of hope for the whole family. Every morning when Dylan wheeled himself down it to catch the specialized bus that took him to school, it represented progress. It meant that even though their world had been turned upside down, they were adapting. They were surviving. They were moving forward. Dylan had started to believe that maybe things were getting better. The physical therapy was working. He'd gotten strong enough to transfer himself from his wheelchair to a regular chair, and he'd even started playing wheelchair basketball with a team in Cedar Rapids. He was thinking about applying to colleges with good adaptive sports programs. For the first time since the accident, he was looking toward the future instead of mourning the past. That's what made what happened on that Tuesday morning in March so devastating. It wasn't just the destruction of a piece of wood and metal. It was the destruction of hope itself. Tuesday morning started like any other day in the Crawford household. Tom left for the construction site at 6:30 a.m., coffee in hand, and his lunch packed in the metal cooler he'd carried for 15 years. Susan was rushing around the kitchen, making sure Emma had her science project materials and that Dylan's medication was in his backpack. The family had developed routines that worked around Dylan's needs without making him feel like a burden. Dylan wheeled himself toward the front door, backpack slung over one shoulder, ready to catch the 7:45 specialized transport bus. He'd been looking forward to this particular Tuesday because his adaptive technology class was presenting their final projects, and Dylan had spent weeks programming a voice-controlled home automation system. It was the kind of work that excited him, using technology to solve real-world problems for people with disabilities. But when he opened the front door, the morning sunlight revealed a scene that made his blood run cold. The ramp wasn't just damaged. It was obliterated. Someone had taken a sledgehammer to the support posts, splintering the pressure-treated lumber his father had carefully selected. The handrails were bent and twisted, yellow paint scraped off in long gouges. Metal brackets hung at odd angles, some completely ripped from their mounting points. Pieces of wood were scattered across the front lawn, like shrapnel from an explosion, but it was the spray paint that hit Dylan the hardest. Across what remained of the ramp's platform, someone had written "cripple" in bold black letters. Below that, in smaller text, "Wheels don't belong here." The paint was still wet enough that Dylan could smell the chemical odor mixing with the morning air. Dylan sat in his wheelchair at the threshold of his own home, unable to move forward, unable to go back. The 3 concrete steps that the ramp had conquered now loomed before him like an impossible barrier. He was trapped in his own doorway, staring at the wreckage of his independence. Emma found him there 10 minutes later when she came looking for him, because the bus had arrived and was honking its horn. She took one look at the destruction and let out a string of curse words that would have gotten her detention if a teacher had heard them. Then she ran to get their mother. Susan Crawford had dealt with a lot of challenges since her son's accident. She'd learned to navigate insurance companies, medical equipment suppliers, and school bureaucrats. She'd developed a thick skin and a determination that surprised even her. But when she saw her son sitting helplessly in front of the destroyed ramp, something inside her cracked. She called Tom immediately. He was 40 minutes away at a job site in Waterloo, but he dropped everything and drove home with his emergency flashes on, probably breaking every speed limit in Black Hawk County. When he saw what had happened, his face went through a series of emotions: shock, rage, and then a grim determination that his family had never seen before. The police arrived 20 minutes after Susan called 911. This time, it wasn't Officer Hughes, but Detective Michael Rodriguez, a newer addition to the Cedar Falls Police Department, who had transferred from Des Moines specifically because he wanted to work in a community where he could make a real difference. Rodriguez was thorough. He took photographs from every angle, measured skid marks in the driveway, and collected paint chips for analysis. He interviewed the neighbors, though most claimed they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual during the night. Mrs. Chen from next door mentioned hearing car doors slamming around 2 a.m., but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. "I have to be honest with you," Rodriguez told Tom and Susan, as Dylan sat nearby, still processing what had happened. "This level of destruction required planning and multiple people. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment prank. Someone came here with tools, with paint, with the specific intention of causing maximum damage and humiliation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Tom's jaw tightened. He'd already figured that out. The way the support posts had been attacked, strategically, at their weakest points, showed that whoever did this understood construction. They knew exactly how to bring the ramp down efficiently. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Rodriguez asked, though the question felt almost rhetorical. Everyone in the room knew who the prime suspects were: Jake Morrison, Brett Morrison, and Chase Williams, Emma said immediately. "They've been terrorizing Dylan for months," Rodriguez nodded. He'd already read the previous reports. "The problem is proving it. These boys have been careful not to leave evidence behind." Dylan finally spoke for the first time since discovering the destruction. "It doesn't matter who did it," he said quietly. "The damage is done." But Tom Crawford wasn't ready to give up. He spent the rest of the day calling lumber yards, calculating costs, trying to figure out how long it would take him to rebuild the ramp. The estimate he came up with made his stomach sink. Between the materials and the time off work he'd need to take, they were looking at over $1,000 and at least 2 weeks of construction, 2 weeks during which Dylan would be essentially trapped in his own home. The story spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. Small towns thrive on gossip, and the destruction of Dylan Crawford's ramp was the kind of shocking incident that had everyone talking. The reactions split along predictable lines. Some people were outraged and offered to help. Others whispered that maybe Dylan should learn to accept his limitations instead of expecting special accommodations. At Cedar Falls High School, The incident created an uncomfortable tension. Students who had been neutral in the ongoing conflict between Dylan and his tormentors were forced to pick sides. Some of Dylan's former teammates from the basketball team started speaking up for him, angry that one of their own had been targeted so viciously. But Jake Morrison's crowd pushed back, suggesting that Dylan was just looking for attention and sympathy. The Morrison and Williams families went into damage control mode. Richard Morrison issued a statement through his law firm denying any involvement by his son and threatening legal action against anyone who spread unsubstantiated accusations. Linda Williams pulled Chase out of school for 3 days, claiming he had the flu, though several students saw him at the mall during school hours. Meanwhile, Dylan was stuck in his house, dependent on his family for everything once again. Simple tasks he'd learned to do independently, like getting the mail or taking out the trash, were suddenly impossible. The psychological impact was almost worse than the physical inconvenience. He'd worked so hard to rebuild his confidence after the accident, and now he felt like he was back at square one. Emma became his lifeline to the outside world. She brought him homework from his teachers, relayed messages from friends, and provided updates on the investigation. She also became his advocate, organizing a group of students to write letters to the school board demanding better protection for students with disabilities. By Thursday afternoon, Tom had taken a personal loan to cover the materials for a new ramp. He planned to start construction over the weekend, working evenings and early mornings around his regular job. But the stress was taking its toll on the whole family. Susan had called in sick to work twice, unable to concentrate on anything but her son's situation. Dylan had missed 3 days of school and was falling behind in his classes. That's when Detective Rodriguez got the break he'd been hoping for. A convenience store. 3 blocks from the Crawford house had security cameras that captured footage of Jake Morrison's distinctive red pickup truck driving slowly past the store at 1:47 a.m. on Tuesday morning. In the truck bed, clearly visible under the streetlight, were what appeared to be construction tools and several cans of spray paint. Rodriguez called the Crawford family with the news on Thursday evening. For the first time since Tuesday morning, there was hope in Tom's voice when he hung up the phone, but none of them could have predicted what would happen next, or that help was about to arrive from the most unexpected source imaginable. Detective Rodriguez was preparing arrest warrants when his phone rang Friday afternoon. The caller identified himself as Vincent Bear Kowalski, and his voice carried the kind of authority that comes from years of commanding respect in difficult situations. "Detective, I heard about what happened to the Crawford kid," Bear said. "I run the Midwest chapter of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, and we'd like to help." Rodriguez paused. The Iron Wolves had a reputation in Iowa, not as troublemakers, but as a brotherhood that took care of their community. They organized charity rides for veterans, escorted funeral processions for fallen police officers, and showed up when people needed help and had nowhere else to turn. Still, the detective was cautious. "What kind of help are we talking about?" Rodriguez asked. "The kind that gets done right," Bear replied. "We heard the family can't afford to rebuild properly, and the kid needs his independence back. We've got carpenters, electricians, concrete workers in our club. Good men who know how to build things that last." Bear Kowalski was 58 years old and had been riding motorcycles for 40 years. He owned a successful roofing company in Cedar Rapids and employed 12 people, half of whom were fellow club members. The Iron Wolves weren't the stereotypical motorcycle gang that people imagine from movies. They were contractors, veterans, teachers, and small business owners who happened to share a love of riding and a commitment to taking care of their own. The club had heard about Dylan's situation through Sarah Martinez, a nurse at the rehabilitation center in Des Moines, where Dylan had received his initial treatment. Sarah's husband, Danny, was a member of the Iron Wolves, and when she told him about the teenage boy whose ramp had been destroyed by bullies, Danny brought the story to the club's weekly meeting. "This is exactly the kind of thing we should be doing," Danny had argued. "Kids been through hell, families struggling, and some punks think they can kick him when he's down. That doesn't fly with me. The vote to help was unanimous. Bear's first call was to Tom Crawford. Tom was skeptical at first. He'd dealt with enough disappointment lately and wasn't sure he could handle false hope. But Bear's straightforward approach won him over. "Mr. Crawford, I'm not going to make this complicated," Bear said. "Your boy needs a ramp. We can build him one that'll last 30 years and look better than anything you've seen. All we need is your permission and one weekend." Tom's voice cracked when he asked, "What's this going to cost me?" "Not a damn penny," Bear replied. "We supply the materials. We supply the labor. You just need to keep your family out of the way while we work." By Friday evening, Bear had mobilized his network. The Iron Wolves had connections throughout central Iowa, and when word spread that they were taking on a project to help a disabled teenager, offers of assistance poured in. Lumber yards offered materials at cost. A concrete company volunteered to donate ready-mix. An electrical supplier provided outdoor lighting fixtures, but it wasn't just about the physical construction. The club members understood that this was about more than building a ramp. It was about sending a message that bullies don't get to win, that communities protect their vulnerable members, and that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Bear assigned specific roles to different club members based on their professional skills. Tommy "Brick" Patterson, who owned a concrete company in Waterloo, would handle the foundation work. Kevin Murphy, an electrician from Dubuque, would install safety lighting and a security system. Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez, no relation to the detective, was a Finnish carpenter who specialized in accessible construction and would oversee the ramp design. The plan was ambitious. Instead of simply rebuilding what had been destroyed, they would create something exceptional. The new ramp would feature a gradual switchback design that would be easier for Dylan to navigate. It would have built-in lighting for safety, decorative stonework to match the house, and a covered platform to protect users from weather. Most importantly, it would be built like a fortress, with steel reinforcement and security features that would make it virtually impossible to vandalize. Sarah Martinez served as the liaison between the club and the Crawford family. As a healthcare professional, she understood Dylan's specific needs and could ensure that the construction would meet all accessibility standards. She visited the Crawford house on Friday evening to take measurements and discuss the family's preferences. "These men have sons and daughters," she told him. "They have family members who've faced challenges. When they see someone being targeted for being different, it goes against everything they believe in. You're not taking anything from them. You're giving them a chance to stand up for what's right." Emma was less reserved in her enthusiasm. She peppered Sarah with questions about motorcycles, construction techniques, and whether she could help with the project. Her energy was infectious, and by the end of Sarah's visit, even Dylan was starting to feel excited about the possibilities. Tom remained cautiously optimistic. He'd worked in construction long enough to know how quickly projects could go wrong, especially when they involved multiple contractors and donated materials. But Bear's professionalism and attention to detail were impressive. When the Iron Wolves president showed up at the house Saturday morning with architectural drawings and a detailed timeline, Tom realized he was dealing with people who knew what they were doing. The materials began arriving before dawn on Saturday. Flatbed trucks pulled up to the Crawford house carrying lumber, concrete forms, steel reinforcement bars, and pallets of decorative stone. The neighbors came out of their houses to watch, some offering coffee and breakfast sandwiches to the workers. By 7 a.m., 15 Iron Wolves members were on site, along with 6 additional volunteers from local trades. The front yard had been transformed into an organized construction zone, with materials sorted by type and tools laid out with military precision. Bear stood in the center of it all, coordinating the work like a general planning a campaign. He'd done this kind of project before. The Iron Wolves had built ramps for 3 other families in Iowa over the past 5 years, but this one felt different. The destruction of Dylan's original ramp hadn't been an accident or the result of wear and tear. It had been a deliberate act of cruelty, and that made the club's response feel like more than construction work. It felt like justice. Dylan watched from his bedroom window as the work began. Heavy machinery arrived to excavate for the new foundation, which would be twice as deep and 3 times as wide as the original ramp's base. The new structure wouldn't just be attached to the house's steps, it would be integrated into the foundation itself, making it a permanent part of the property. Word of the project spread throughout Cedar Falls. Local news station KWWL sent a crew to cover the story, though Bear politely declined most interview requests. "We're not doing this for publicity," he told the reporter. "We're doing it because it's the right thing to do," but the story couldn't be contained. Social media posts about the Iron Wolves project began circulating, and by Saturday afternoon, additional volunteers were showing up without being asked. Neighbors brought coolers of drinks and homemade meals. A group of high school students, led by some of Dylan's former basketball teammates, arrived with hand-painted signs supporting Dylan. Even more importantly, parents in the community began having conversations with their children about bullying, disability, and standing up for others. The visible demonstration of community support was changing the narrative around Dylan's situation from one of victimization to one of empowerment. As the sun set on Saturday evening, the foundation was complete and the framing for the ramp was taking shape. What had started as an act of destruction was being transformed into something beautiful and permanent, but the real transformation was still to come. Sunday morning arrived with an energy that Cedar Falls hadn't felt in years. By 6 a.m., the Crawford front yard resembled a small construction festival. The Iron Wolves had worked through the night in shifts, their motorcycle headlights illuminating the worksite as they laid the foundation's final concrete pour. Steam rose from the curing concrete in the cool morning air, and the sound of power tools harmonized with the rumble of Harley-Davidson engines. Dylan woke to voices outside his window, not the harsh voices he'd grown accustomed to, but voices filled with purpose and camaraderie. When he looked outside, he saw something that took his breath away. The skeletal framework of what would become his new ramp stretched across the front yard, but this wasn't just a replacement for what had been destroyed. This was architecture. The design incorporated 3 switching platforms, creating a gentle zigzag pattern that would make the ascent effortless while providing rest areas at each turn. Decorative stonework was already being installed along the sides, with built-in planters that Susan could fill with flowers. Solar-powered LED lights were embedded in the handrails, designed to automatically illuminate the path from dusk to dawn. Tank Rodriguez was putting the finishing touches on the carpentry work when Dylan's wheelchair appeared in the doorway. The master carpenter looked up from his work and grinned. "Morning, champ. Want to see something cool?" Tank led Dylan to a control panel that had been installed next to the front door. With the press of a button, the ramp's lighting system activated, even in broad daylight. Another button activated a small sound system that could play music or, more importantly, serve as an emergency communication device connected directly to the Cedar Falls Police Department. "Your sister Emma suggested the panic button," Tank explained. "Smart kid. She said if anyone ever tries to mess with you or this ramp again, you can have police here in under 3 minutes." But the security features went beyond electronics. Bear had consulted with a structural engineer from Iowa State University, and the new ramp was built to withstand not just weather and normal wear, but deliberate sabotage. The support posts were filled with concrete and anchored 8 feet deep. The decking was made from composite materials that couldn't be easily cut or burned. The handrails were reinforced with steel cable running through the interior. "Someone would need explosives to take this thing down," Bear told Tom, as they stood admiring the nearly completed project. And even then, they'd probably just scratched the surface. The community response had grown throughout the weekend. What started as a motorcycle club service project had evolved into a town-wide demonstration of support for Dylan and rejection of the bullying that had plagued him. Local businesses had contributed materials without being asked. The Methodist Church had set up a food station for the workers. Even Mayor Patricia Jenkins had stopped by to personally thank the volunteers. But the most significant moment came Sunday afternoon when Detective Rodriguez arrived with news about the investigation. He found Bear and Tom inspecting the ramp's safety features and asked to speak with the family privately. "We've made arrests," Rodriguez announced. Jake Morrison, Brett Morrison, and Chase Williams were taken into custody this morning. "We have security footage, paint evidence that matches what was found at the scene, and one of them confessed when faced with the evidence." Emma let out a whoop of celebration, but Dylan's reaction was more subdued. The arrest felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had happened. The bullies had been caught, but more importantly, they'd been proven irrelevant. While they were destroying things in the darkness, the community was building something beautiful in the light. The legal consequences were swift and appropriate. All three boys were charged with criminal mischief and harassment. Because the attack targeted Dylan's disability, additional hate crime enhancements were applied. Jake Morrison, as the ringleader, faced the most serious charges. His father's political connections couldn't protect him from clear evidence and community outrage. More importantly, the incident had changed the social dynamics at Cedar Falls High School. Students who had previously remained silent about bullying were speaking up. The administration, embarrassed by the negative publicity, implemented new anti-bullying policies with real enforcement mechanisms. Dylan's former basketball teammates had formed an informal support network, not just for him, but for other students who faced harassment. As the sun began to set Sunday evening, the final touches were being applied to Dylan's new ramp. The stonework was complete, revealing an elegant design that complemented the house's architecture. The lighting system cast a warm glow over the entire structure. Native Iowa plants had been installed in the built-in planters, chosen specifically because they would bloom throughout the spring and summer. Bear gathered all the volunteers for a final inspection before presenting the completed project to the Crawford family. 73 people had contributed to the construction over 2 days: Iron Wolves members, local tradesmen, neighbors, and students. They stood together on the front lawn, their faces showing the satisfaction that comes from transforming an act of hate into something beautiful. "Dylan," Bear called out, "would you like to be the first person to use your new ramp?" The teenager wheeled himself to the base of the structure, where a small ceremony was taking place. Sarah Martinez had prepared a short speech about community, resilience, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. But when she saw Dylan's face, a mixture of gratitude, amazement, and something approaching joy, she decided words weren't necessary. Dylan began his ascent slowly, savoring each moment. The ramp's gradient was perfect, requiring minimal effort to navigate. The handrails were positioned exactly right for someone of his height and arm strength. When he reached the first platform, he paused and looked back at the crowd of people who had made this possible. The view from the platform was different than he expected. He could see over the hedges into Mrs. Chen's garden, where she was watching from her porch and waving. He could see down the street toward the school, where his future waited. Most importantly, he could see his family's faces, glowing with pride and relief. When Dylan reached the front door, completing his journey up the new ramp, the crowd erupted in applause. But the sound was quickly drowned out by something else, the roar of 73 motorcycle engines starting in unison. The Iron Wolves were preparing for their traditional departure, riding out together in formation. As the motorcycles pulled away from the Crawford house, their headlights illuminating the evening air, Dylan remained on his new platform. He pressed the button that activated the LED lighting system, watching as the entire ramp was bathed in soft, welcoming light. Tom put his hand on his son's shoulder. "What do you think, buddy?" Dylan considered the question seriously. 3 days ago, he'd been trapped in his own home, feeling helpless and defeated. Tonight, he had a ramp that was more beautiful and functional than anything he could have imagined. But more than that, He had learned something about his community, about the kindness of strangers, and about his own strength. "I think," Dylan said finally, "that some people try to tear things down and other people build them back up better than before." The next morning, when Dylan wheeled down his new ramp to catch the school bus, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: excitement about the future. The bullies had been arrested, his independence had been restored, and his community had shown him that he wasn't alone. But perhaps most importantly, Dylan Crawford had learned that sometimes the most unexpected heroes arrive when you need them most. Riding Harley-Davidsons and carrying tool belts instead of capes. 3 months after the completion of Dylan's ramp, the effects of what happened in Cedar Falls were still spreading in ways no one could have predicted. The story had taken on a life of its own, inspiring similar projects across Iowa and neighboring states. But for Dylan Crawford, the most important changes were the ones happening right at home. The first surprise came in April, when Dylan received a letter from the University of Northern Iowa's Adaptive Athletics program. Coach Jennifer Walsh had heard about Dylan's story through the National Wheelchair Basketball Network and wanted to offer him a spot on their team, along with an academic scholarship to study biomedical engineering. The scholarship wasn't just based on his athletic potential. It was specifically for students who had demonstrated resilience in overcoming physical challenges. "Your story shows exactly the kind of character we're looking for," Coach Walsh explained during her visit to Cedar Falls. "But more than that, your experience with accessibility issues and adaptive technology makes you a perfect candidate for our engineering program. We need people who understand these challenges from the inside." Dylan had never seriously considered biomedical engineering before his accident. His dreams had been focused on sports medicine and physical therapy. But as he learned more about the field, he realized it was a perfect match for his interests and experiences. He could develop better wheelchairs, improved accessibility technology, and solutions to problems that only someone who lived with a disability would understand. The scholarship opportunity also meant that the financial strain on the Crawford family would be dramatically reduced. Tom wouldn't have to work overtime constantly, and Susan could return to full-time work at the library, which she genuinely enjoyed. For the first time since the accident, the family could think about the future without anxiety about money dominating every conversation. But Dylan's story was having impacts far beyond his own family. The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club had received over 200 requests for similar assistance from families across the Midwest. Bear Kowalski had to create a formal application process and recruit additional volunteers to handle the demand. "We never expected this kind of response," Bear admitted during a club meeting in May, "but it shows there's a real need out there. People with disabilities who need help, and communities that want to step up but don't know how." The club decided to formalize their accessibility construction program, partnering with Habitat for Humanity and the Iowa Department of Human Services to identify families who needed assistance. They also began working with construction trade schools to train more volunteers in accessible design principles. Sarah Martinez left her position at the Rehabilitation Center to become the program's full-time coordinator. Her medical background and experience with adaptive equipment made her invaluable in ensuring that each project met the specific needs of its recipients. She also served as a bridge between the motorcycle club culture and the healthcare system, helping both sides understand each other better. The legal aftermath of the vandalism case continued to unfold throughout the spring. Jake Morrison received community service hours specifically focused on disability awareness. He was required to volunteer at the same rehabilitation center where Dylan had received his initial treatment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. Brett Morrison and Chase Williams faced similar sentences, but their responses were markedly different. Chase seemed to genuinely understand the impact of his actions and threw himself into the volunteer work, eventually asking to continue beyond his required hours. Brett remained resentful and completed his service with minimal effort, his attitude unchanged by the experience. More significantly, the case had prompted the Iowa legislature to strengthen hate crime laws specifically related to disability harassment. Representative Maria Gonzalez from Cedar Falls had introduced legislation that increased penalties for crimes targeting people with disabilities and required schools to implement more robust anti-bullying programs. What happened to Dylan? Crawford exposed a gap in our legal protections. Representative Gonzalez explained during legislative hearings. We need laws that recognize that attacking someone's mobility equipment or accessibility modifications is equivalent to attacking the person themselves. The legislation, dubbed Dylan's Law by local media, passed with bipartisan support and became a model for similar laws in other states. At Cedar Falls High School, the changes were equally dramatic. Principal Davis had retired, replaced by Dr. Angela Thompson, a former special education administrator who brought a completely different approach to disability inclusion. The school implemented peer mentorship programs, redesigned physical spaces for better accessibility, and created a student-led disability awareness club. Emma Crawford had become one of the club's most active members, using her experience as Dylan's advocate to help other students navigate similar challenges. Her passion for social justice had found a perfect outlet, and her grades had improved dramatically now that she wasn't constantly worried about protecting her brother. Dylan himself had become something of a local celebrity, though he tried to handle the attention with grace. He'd been invited to speak at several schools about bullying prevention and disability awareness. His message was always the same: focus on what you can do, not what you can't. And never underestimate the power of community support. But perhaps the most unexpected development came in June, when Dylan received a phone call from a documentary filmmaker named Alex Chen from Los Angeles. Chen wanted to create a film about the Iron Wolves Project and its impact on disability advocacy nationwide. Your story represents something really important, Chen explained during their conversation. It shows how ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they decide to act instead of just sympathizing. The documentary project would involve following Dylan through his first year of college, checking in with other families who had received help from the Iron Wolves program, and examining the broader issues of disability inclusion in American communities. Dylan was hesitant at first. He'd had enough attention for one lifetime, but ultimately agreed because he saw the potential to help other families going through similar experiences. The filming began in July, with Chen's crew documenting Dylan's preparation for college and his ongoing involvement with the wheelchair basketball team he'd joined in Cedar Rapids. The team had won their regional championship, with Dylan serving as starting point guard, a position that felt familiar and new at the same time. Tom Crawford had also experienced unexpected opportunities. His work on Dylan's original ramp, combined with his collaboration with the Iron Wolves on the replacement project, had given him expertise in accessible construction that was increasingly in demand. He'd started a side business specializing in accessibility modifications, with referrals coming from occupational therapists, disability advocacy groups, and word-of-mouth recommendations. I never thought Dylan's accident would lead to me finding a new career direction, Tom reflected. But working with families who need these modifications has been incredibly rewarding. I understand what they're going through in a way that other contractors might not. The success of Tom's business also meant that the Crawford family could afford to make additional improvements to their home. They'd added a roll-in shower, lowered kitchen counters, and created a fully accessible basement workshop where Dylan could pursue his interest in adaptive technology projects. As summer progressed, Dylan began preparing for his departure to the University of Northern Iowa. The transition felt different than it would have before his accident. There were medical considerations, equipment needs, and accessibility concerns that other students didn't face. But there was also an excitement about the future that he hadn't felt since before the car accident. The Iron Wolves organized a farewell barbecue for Dylan in August, held at the local park, with grills provided by several club members. Over 300 people attended, including many who had worked on the ramp project, classmates from high school, and families from across Iowa who had benefited from similar Iron Wolves construction projects. Bear Kowalski presented Dylan with a leather jacket bearing the club's emblem, not a full membership, since Dylan didn't ride motorcycles, but an honorary recognition of his role in inspiring their accessibility advocacy program. "You taught us something important," Bear said during his presentation. "Sometimes the best way to fight back against hate is to build something beautiful. That ramp isn't just wood and stone and metal. It's proof that communities can choose to lift people up instead of tearing them down." As the barbecue continued into the evening, Dylan found himself thinking about how much had changed since that terrible Tuesday morning when he discovered his destroyed ramp. The bullies who had tried to limit his world had inadvertently helped expand it in ways he never could have imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he prepared for college. But tonight was about celebrating how far he'd come and acknowledging all the people who had helped make the journey possible. 5 years later, Dr. Dylan Crawford adjusted his graduation cap and looked out over the University of Northern Iowa campus, where he'd just completed his PhD in biomedical engineering. At 23, he was younger than most doctoral graduates, but his research on next-generation wheelchair propulsion systems had attracted attention from major medical device companies and rehabilitation centers across the country. His dissertation defense that morning had gone flawlessly. The examining committee was particularly impressed with his prototype for a smart wheelchair system that could navigate curbs, stairs, and other obstacles automatically. The technology wasn't just theoretical. Dylan had been field testing it for 6 months, and the results were revolutionary. "Your work represents the future of mobility assistance," Dr. Patricia Saunders, his dissertation advisor, had told him after the defense. "But more than that, it represents hope for millions of people who are currently limited by existing technology." Standing in the campus courtyard after the ceremony, Dylan reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The scared 17-year-old who had discovered his destroyed ramp 5 years ago felt like a different person entirely. That boy had been focused on what he couldn't do anymore. This young man was focused on what was possible. His parents, Tom and Susan, stood nearby talking with Bear Kowalski, who had driven up from Cedar Rapids for the graduation ceremony. Bear had aged in the past 5 years. His beard was more gray than black now, but his presence was as commanding as ever. The Iron Wolves had expanded their accessibility program to 12 states, completing over 400 construction projects and training thousands of volunteers in accessible design principles. "I still remember the first time I saw you on that ramp we built," Bear was telling Tom. "Kid looked like he was afraid to believe good things could happen to him. Look at him now." Emma, now a junior at Iowa State University studying social work, was live-streaming the graduation ceremony for the documentary that had been following Dylan's story. Alex Chen's film had premiered at the Sundance Film Festival the previous year and gone on to win an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. The success had brought international attention to disability advocacy and the power of community action. The documentary's impact had been extraordinary. Motorcycle clubs across North America had started their own accessibility programs, modeling their efforts on the Iron Wolves approach. Construction trade schools had added accessible design courses to their curricula. Most importantly, the film had changed conversations about disability from focusing on limitations to celebrating possibilities. Sarah Martinez, now the director of the National Accessible Construction Initiative, had flown in from Washington, D.C. for Dylan's graduation. Her organization, which grew out of the Iron Wolves program, had become a major force in disability advocacy and had successfully lobbied for federal funding for accessibility modifications in low-income housing. Dylan's story became everyone's story. Sarah explained to a reporter who was covering the graduation. It showed that with the right support and community involvement, barriers become opportunities. The legal legacy of Dylan's case continued to evolve as well. Dylan's law had been adopted by 37 states, and several Supreme Court decisions had cited it in rulings about disability rights. Jake Morrison, ironically, had gone on to become a disability rights lawyer. Though he and Dylan had never spoken directly about their shared history, Detective Rodriguez, now chief of police in Cedar Falls, had established a specialized unit focused on bias crimes and had become a national expert on investigating disability-targeted harassment. His thorough investigation of Dylan's case had become a textbook example of how to properly handle such incidents. But for Dylan, the most meaningful changes were the personal ones. He'd met his girlfriend, Dr. Rebecca Torres, during his second year of graduate school. She was completing her residency in rehabilitation medicine, and they'd bonded over their shared passion for improving quality of life for people with disabilities. Their relationship had grown from professional collaboration to deep personal connection, and Dylan was planning to propose after they both started their new jobs in Chicago. Rebecca understood Dylan's disability in a way that went beyond medical knowledge. She'd grown up with a deaf brother and knew that disabilities were simply different ways of experiencing the world, not limitations to be overcome. When they worked together on research projects, Dylan's insights from living with a spinal cord injury were as valuable as her medical expertise. The job waiting for Dylan in Chicago was a dream position: lead engineer for adaptive technology at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, one of the world's premier rehabilitation hospitals. He'd be working with patients directly, designing custom solutions for their specific needs, and conducting research that could benefit millions of people worldwide. His first project would be expanding the smart wheelchair system he'd developed for his dissertation. The initial prototype could navigate most architectural barriers, but Dylan envisioned something much more comprehensive, a mobility system that would give users complete independence in any environment. Tom Crawford's accessibility construction business had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. Crawford Adaptive Construction now employed 15 people and had contracts throughout the Midwest. More importantly, Tom had become an advocate for inclusive design principles, working with architects and developers to create buildings that were naturally accessible rather than retrofitted after construction. The original ramp that the Iron Wolves had built for Dylan had become something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in disability advocacy. The Cedar Falls Chamber of Commerce had created a self-guided tour that included the Crawford House, and visitors from around the world came to see where the movement had started. The ramp itself had aged beautifully. The stonework had weathered to a natural patina. The native plants in the built-in planters had matured into a lush garden, and the solar lighting system continued to function perfectly. Most importantly, it had never required any repairs beyond routine maintenance. As the graduation celebration continued, Dylan found himself drawn to a quiet corner of the campus courtyard where he could process the magnitude of the day. His phone buzzed with congratulations from people around the world. Former patients he'd worked with during his clinical rotations, researchers who had followed his work, and disability advocates who saw him as a symbol of what was possible. But the message that meant the most came from an unexpected source. It was from Marcus Williams, Chase Williams's younger brother, who had been in middle school during the original incident. Marcus had just graduated from high school and was starting college in the fall, planning to study special education. Dr. Crawford, the message read, "I wanted you to know that watching how you handled what my brother and his friends did to you changed my entire perspective on what it means to be strong. Your example taught me that real strength comes from building people up, not tearing them down." Thank you for showing our whole community what resilience looks like. Dylan stared at the message for a long moment, remembering the angry 13-year-old boy who had watched his brother get arrested 5 years ago. The fact that Marcus had found his own path to helping others showed that positive change could ripple through families and generations in ways that were impossible to predict. As the sun began to set over the campus, Dylan rejoined his family and friends for dinner at a local restaurant. The Iron Wolves members present had ridden their motorcycles to the graduation ceremony, and their bikes were lined up outside the restaurant like an honor guard. During dinner, Bear stood to offer a toast. 5 years ago, we met a kid who needed a ramp, he said, raising his glass. Today, we're celebrating a man who's going to build bridges for millions of people. Dylan, you taught us that sometimes the best response to hate is not revenge, but excellence. You took what those bullies meant for destruction and turned it into a foundation for helping others. Dylan rose to respond, feeling the weight of the moment. 5 years ago, I thought my world was ending, he said. I couldn't see past my limitations, and I certainly couldn't imagine that something good could come from something so painful. But you all showed me that communities can choose to lift people up instead of letting them fall. The ramp you built didn't just give me physical access to my house. It gave me access to hope. He paused, looking around the table at the faces of people who had changed his life in ways they probably didn't fully understand. The work I'm going to do in Chicago, the research I've completed, the opportunities I've had, none of it would have been possible without that moment when strangers decided to care about a kid they'd never met. You didn't just rebuild a ramp, you rebuilt a life. As the evening wound down and the Iron Wolves prepared for their ride back to Cedar Rapids, Dylan stood in the restaurant parking lot, surrounded by the sound of motorcycle engines warming up. Bear approached him for a final goodbye. You know, kid, we've built a lot of ramps over the years, Bear said, but yours will always be special. Not because it was the first, but because it taught us that construction work can be a form of love. Dylan nodded, understanding exactly what Bear meant. Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the people who save you are the ones you never see coming. Bear grinned and climbed onto his Harley. Take care of yourself, Dr. Crawford, and remember, if you ever need us, we're just a phone call away. As the motorcycles pulled away into the night, their taillights disappearing down the highway, Dylan felt a profound sense of completion. The scared teenager who had been trapped by circumstances beyond his control had become a young man who was determined to remove barriers for others. Tomorrow, he would start a new chapter in Chicago, working to ensure that other people facing similar challenges would have better options than he'd had. But tonight was about gratitude for the community that had rallied around him, for the opportunities that had emerged from tragedy, and for the understanding that sometimes the worst moments in life create the foundation for the best ones. The ramp in Cedar Falls would remain, a testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. But its real legacy was walking away on that graduation night, ready to build bridges between what is and what could be, one innovation at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.